There's a moment, and if you've ever stood in one place long enough, you know the one where your body stops feeling like yours. Your feet go first, then your knees. Then, somewhere around the 40-minute mark, your jaw starts to hum, this low buzz like a transformer box in the rain, and you have to concentrate, actually concentrate, on keeping your teeth from clicking together. Most people have never had to think about blinking. Private Marcus Ellery had thought about nothing else for 11 months. It was the second Tuesday of November. Not that the date meant anything to anyone standing outside the guardhouse at Horse Guards Parade. To tourists, every day looks the same. The red coat, the bearskin, the stillness that reads from 20 feet away like something carved rather than born. He'd known it since the night before, lying on his back in the barracks, staring at the ceiling, running through the checklist the way you do when sleep stops cooperating. Boots, belt, buttons, posture. The bearskins strapped correctly, not tilted, never tilted, the chin strap biting a familiar groove into the underside of his jaw. Gloves without a wrinkle. Rifle at exact angle. And eyes. Eyes forward. Eyes still. Eyes that see without appearing to. The wind off the Thames that morning came in sideways, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just arrives mid-thought and shoves. It carried grit. The microscopic city grit that London manufactures in industrial quantities. Exhaust particles, construction dust, the dried ghost of 10,000 footsteps. It wasn't malicious. The wind didn't know what it was walking into. But Ellery felt it. The precise moment it hit his left eye, he felt it like a needle. Here's what you don't know about standing guard unless someone's told you. The eye thing isn't about willpower. That's the civilian misunderstanding. That the guards are just stubbornly refusing to blink, flexing some yogic discipline they learned in training. It's not that. It's closer to performance. The eyes must appear still. They must point forward in a way that says, I'm looking at nothing, and I am looking at everything, and I will not distinguish between the two. Blinking happens. Of course it happens. The body doesn't ask permission for physiological necessities. But there's a blink, and then there's a blink. The first kind is invisible. A quarter second. Both lids. Clean. The second kind, the one that happens when your cornea has just received a piece of London grit traveling at 20 kilometers an hour, is the kind that crumples the whole left side of your face. A full-body flinch starting in the socket and radiating out. The eye squeezed shut. The cheek raised. The jaw shifted. That's not a blink. That's a tell. Color Sergeant Diane Pryor had been conducting inspections for 7 years. She had the walk that inspectors develop. Not a march, not a stroll, something in between. A controlled momentum. She moved along the line of guards the way a conductor moves through an orchestra mid-performance, taking in everything, acknowledging nothing, prepared to stop without warning. She had a clipboard. She always had a clipboard. Some of the younger privates thought the clipboard was theatrical, a prop to make her look more official. It wasn't. She wrote on it. She wrote in it in a hand that was smaller than you'd expect, tight, controlled cursive that looked like it didn't want to take up more space than necessary. She had caught the following things on inspection in the preceding 7 years. A tarnish button, second from the top, on a guard who swore he'd polished everything. He hadn't. She'd found it in under 4 seconds. A rifle held at an angle that deviated 2 degrees from regulation. 2, which most people, including 3 of her fellow color sergeants, would have passed without noticing. A guardsman who had begun to sway, imperceptibly, barely, the way tall trees do in a light wind, at minute 43 of his post. She'd marked it, spoken to him afterward. He'd developed a stress fracture in his left foot he hadn't reported. She noticed things because noticing things was the job. This was the first thing they told you in training, though they said it differently. An inspection is not a performance. An inspection is a measurement. Ellery heard her before he saw her. He didn't turn his head, never turn the head, but peripheral vision is wider than most people think, and sound carries differently when you're standing still. Her boots on the cobblestones had a particular rhythm, not military precise, which would have been almost soothing, predictable. Hers were deliberate, but uneven. She paused. She considered. She moved again. She was 3 men down from him when the wind arrived. He didn't feel it coming. The grit hit his left eye, and his body made a decision before his brain had the chance to veto it. He blinked. Not a quarter second. Not clean. The left side of his face pulled tight, a half wince, a fraction of a crumple, and his eye held shut for maybe half a second too long, the involuntary thing you do when something is in there and you're trying to clear it. Half a second. Less time than it takes to drop a coin and watch it land. His eye opened. His face returned to position. He didn't move otherwise. Didn't adjust. Didn't look around. The grit was still there. He could feel it, this tiny hot point of irritation sitting at the inner corner, his eye watering slightly, just slightly, which he could not address, could not touch, could not blink away again without making it worse. 2 men down from him now. 1 man down. He heard the pause. Pryor stopped in front of Private Marcus Ellery at 9:17 in the morning. She had a system. She looked at the top first, bearskin, chin strap, then worked downward. It took her approximately 12 seconds per guard when everything was correct. She'd never timed it herself, but the men had. Word got around. 12 seconds was passing. Longer than 12 was a conversation you didn't want to have. She looked at his bearskin, his chin strap, his shoulders, his coat, buttons, belt buckle, gloves, rifle angle, boots. Then she looked at his eyes. His left eye was watering, not crying, not dramatically. A single line of moisture, barely there, tracking from the inner corner toward his cheekbone. The eye itself was slightly redder than the right. She looked at his face. He was holding it completely still now. Whatever had happened, she caught the tail end of it from her peripheral vision, a micro-expression she couldn't have named without having seen 10,000 of them. Was over. He was back, locked in. The posture was correct. The angle was correct. The chin was correct. But the eye was telling a different story. She looked at her clipboard. She didn't write anything yet. She looked back at him. 12 seconds passed. Then 13. Then 14. She made a mark. One small mark. The pen moving in a gesture so economical it barely looked like writing. She moved on. Ellery felt the moment she moved past him the way you feel a fever break. His lungs, which had apparently stopped fully functioning in the last 90 seconds, remembered their purpose. The grit was still in his eye. The moisture was still tracking down his cheek. He couldn't do a single thing about either. He stood. The tourists along the perimeter railing were doing what tourists always do. Some photographing, some just watching, some talking in voices that carried because they decided the guards couldn't hear them, but didn't mind, or weren't real in the way that normal people were real. A child was pointing. A woman in an orange coat was explaining something to the man next to her, gesturing with both hands in the direction of the guardhouse. None of them had seen the mark go on the clipboard. None of them knew what 12 seconds versus 14 seconds meant. Ellery knew. He'd known it before the pen had moved, in that suspended half moment where Pryor's eyes were on his face, and the wind was still coming in off the Thames, and the city was doing all its ordinary, indifferent things around him. He knew before the inspection ended, before the line was dismissed, before Color Sergeant Pryor walked back toward the building with her clipboard tucked under her arm, not looking back, not explaining. He'd known it in his left eye, in the way it was still faintly burning, in the way his body had made a decision without asking him. One blink. That's all it was. One blink, and now there was a mark, and by the end of the day there would be a note. The tourists didn't know what they were looking at. They never do. They see the stillness, and they think it's about control. About the show of control. The pageantry of men who won't move, won't react, won't acknowledge you even when you shout in their faces or make obscene gestures 3 inches from their helmets. They think it's theater. They're not wrong. But it's the kind of theater where the script is also the law. And the law had a clipboard. And the clipboard had a mark. And somewhere in the building behind Marcus Ellery's rigid, red-coated, completely still back, a piece of paper was waiting to become official. He had 43 more minutes on his post. He stood through all of them. The grit eventually worked its way out. Or maybe he just stopped feeling it, the way you stop feeling a bruise after long enough. The moisture dried on his cheek. The redness in his eye faded, or faded enough that no one standing at the tourist railing would have seen it. He looked, from the outside, exactly as he was supposed to look. which is the cruelest kind of too late. The thing about a disciplinary note is that it doesn't feel like anything when it's being written. That's the part nobody tells you. You imagine it would feel significant, some kind of formal weight to the moment, a door closing, a consequence clicking into place. You imagine the person writing it is thinking about you, specifically you, the way a judge looks at the accused when delivering a verdict. Color Sergeant Pryor was eating a sandwich when she wrote it up. The office she used for post-inspection paperwork was a room that had once been something else, a supply cupboard, maybe, or a duty room that got downsized when they reorganized the floor plan in 1994 or thereabouts. Nobody was entirely sure. It was narrow, with a window that faced an interior courtyard and therefore received approximately 40 minutes of direct light per day, usually in the mid-afternoon, when it was no longer useful to anyone. She had a desk, a chair, a second chair that no one ever sat in, which had a stack of binders on it that hadn't moved in 2 years. She ate a ham and mustard sandwich at 11:40. She made her way through the morning's inspection notes in order, guard by guard. Most were clean, a notation here or there, things she'd flag verbally rather than formally. Boots not at the exact regulation shine on Private Keneally. She'd mention it to him. First offense, not worth the paperwork. Corporal Adis's chin strap had been riding slightly loose, probably stretched with use, needed replacing. She got to Ellery. She looked at her clipboard note. 1 mark, her private shorthand, which translated to facial lapse, uncontrolled, inspection visible. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then, she picked up her pen. The note she wrote was not long. Disciplinary notes rarely are. They don't need to be long. A single paragraph, formal language, the kind that sounds like it was written by a Victorian administrator and never updated, because why would you update what already works? The language is not cruel. It is not kind. It is neutral in the way that machines are neutral, in the way that a measurement is neutral. Private Ellery, M. During routine inspection on the above date, an involuntary facial response was observed in breach of presentation standards. The nature of the response, a prolonged bilateral blink and associated microexpression, was inconsistent with expected composure post. This constitutes a breach of standards under Regulation 7.4b. A formal notation has been placed on record. No further action is indicated at this time unless a pattern of similar conduct is identified in subsequent inspections. No further action indicated. She capped her pen. She ate the last of her sandwich. The thing about Private Ellery was that Pryor had been watching him for 3 months. Not in any suspicious way. Not with any particular intention. It was more that she noticed the ones who were trying the hardest. Not because she wanted to catch them, but because they were interesting. The ones who were fighting with themselves up there on the post, who hadn't yet made peace with the stillness, who were in the middle of learning something that nobody can really teach you, something you can only figure out on your own through enough hours of standing in wind. Ellery was one of those. She'd seen him on post a dozen times before today. He had the physical part down, the posture, the angle, the bearing. Those were coachable things, and he was a good student. What he hadn't figured out yet was the psychological architecture, the interior stillness that produces exterior stillness without effort. Most guards, when they first get posted, fight the wind. They resist it consciously. Every gust is something to be survived, endured, held against. You can see it on their faces if you know what to look for: the bracing, the micro-tension around the eyes and jaw, the body preparing to be tested. The guards who've been doing it long enough stopped fighting. They found something else, some internal arrangement with the conditions. The cold was the cold. The grit was the grit. The eye would water if the eye needed to water. None of it was a crisis unless you decided it was. Ellery hadn't found that yet, which was fine. 11 months in, most of them hadn't. But the note was the note. He found out at 1400 hours, not because she called him in. The note was processed through the official system, which meant it arrived on a list, which meant someone checked the list during the afternoon administrative cycle, which meant Private Ellery's squad corporal, a man named Hargreaves who had all the warmth of a filing cabinet, tapped him on the shoulder at 2 p.m. and said, with the emotional investment of someone reading out a bus schedule, "Disciplinary note. Your locker by end of day," and walked away. Ellery stood in the corridor for a moment. He'd known it was coming since 9:17 that morning. Knowing something is coming doesn't prepare you for it. That's the lie they sell you. The idea that anticipation is preparation, that you can pre-absorb a thing before it arrives. You can't. The note arriving was a different thing than knowing the note was coming, the same way rain is a different thing than a weather forecast. He went to his locker. The note was already there, in a sealed envelope, because the system was faster than it deserved to be. He opened it. Read it. Regulation 7.4b. Facial response. Inconsistent with expected composure. Notation placed on record. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original crease and put it back in the envelope and sat on the bench in front of his locker and looked at his boots. His boots were very clean. He'd polished them for an hour the night before. 3 other men in his squad found out about the note by dinner time. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't said a word. But the administrative cycle talks to itself. A clerk mentions it to another clerk, a corporal reads a list, and by the time the mess hall fills up the information has made its own way through the building the way water finds its own way through cracks. Private Yates, who had been posted 6 months longer than Ellery, and therefore considered himself an authority on all things, sat down across from him with a tray and said, "Heard you blinked." Ellery looked at him. "Wind," he said. "Always wind," Yates said. He said it without mockery, which was somehow worse than mockery. Pure statement of fact. Yes, it is always the wind, and yes, it will still go on your record, and yes, that is the situation you are in. Pryor catch it? Yeah. Yates nodded. Took a spoonful of whatever was being called soup that evening. She catched Drummond last spring. Same thing. I water. He thought he'd hit it. He shook his head. Man, she doesn't miss. I know, Ellery said. No back. Standard language. Pattern of conduct clause? Yeah. Yates nodded again. The pattern of conduct clause meant once is a note, twice is a conversation, 3 times is a different conversation, one nobody wants to have. So don't blink. Ellery picked up his fork. Put it down. I know. I mean it. Don't blink. I said I know. The mess hall noise moved around them, trays and voices and the institutional clatter of 200 people eating in a space designed to accommodate 200 people, and nothing comfortable about it. Someone at the far table was laughing, the kind of laugh that doesn't know it's being loud. Ellery stared at his food. The grit. The wind. The half-second the left side of his face had done what it wanted to do instead of what he'd told it to do. Pattern of conduct. He thought about his father, who had served 22 years and left the regiment with a record so clean it was almost boring, almost theatrical in its cleanness. His father who had stood in rain that would have made ordinary men weep and returned to barracks looking like he'd been standing in sunshine, who had never, in 22 years, received a disciplinary note of any kind. His father who, when Ellery had told him he'd been selected for the household division, had said, "It'll teach you what you're made of." The soup was getting cold. Ellery picked up his fork again and started eating. He lay on his back that night and looked at the ceiling. The barrack ceiling was exactly as interesting as barrack ceilings have always been, which is to say not at all, which is the point. You're not supposed to find the ceiling interesting. You're supposed to look at it and eventually stop looking at it and sleep. He went through the inspection in his head. The wind. The angle of it. 9:17. The grit in the left eye. He could still feel it, or thought he could, some phantom echo of the irritation. The way his face had reacted before he could stop it. Pryor standing in front of him, her eyes moving up and down, the 12 seconds becoming 14. The mark going on the clipboard. Here's what he kept coming back to, lying on his back in the dark. He hadn't been lazy. He hadn't been sloppy. He hadn't stopped caring or started assuming. He'd been standing at his post for 2 hours and 12 minutes at the time of the inspection, and in those 2 hours and 12 minutes he had not moved, had not adjusted, had not flinched. Not at the tourist who'd stepped too close to the railing, not at the car backfiring somewhere on the road behind him, not at the child who'd shouted something in his direction and then laughed when he didn't react. None of that. And then the wind. And then the half-second. And now there was a note in an envelope in his locker. His body had made a decision he hadn't authorized. That's what kept snagging on something. not the note itself. He'd accepted the note. The system was what it was, and the system didn't grade on effort, didn't factor in 2 hours of correct behavior against half a second of incorrect. The system measured the half second, and that was correct, that was the job. What he couldn't get past was the betrayal of it. His own face, his own eye, deciding something without him. He thought he'd had more control than that. Apparently his left eye had a different opinion. He slept eventually. The ceiling helped. It always does. The boring thing, the nothing thing, the surface that gives you nothing back. You look at it long enough, and something finally gives out, and that something is usually the mind's insistence on churning. He slept. In the morning his locker still had the envelope. He left it there and went to stand in front of his mirror and looked at his own face and blinked deliberately, consciously, watching his eyelids move. Then did it again. Then stood very still and tried not to. His eyes, without anything in them, in still air, held for approximately 23 seconds before the reflex fired. 23 seconds. Next time he'd need it to be longer. He had 13 days until his next scheduled post. He had 13 days to make a deal with his own face. 13 days is a strange length of time. Long enough to feel meaningful. Short enough to vanish. Ellery spent the first 2 of them being angry at himself in the quiet, efficient way that doesn't look like anger from the outside. He ate correctly. He reported on time. He cleaned his equipment with exactly the attention it required and not a molecule more. From the outside, he was fine. From the inside, he was having a very focused, very circular argument with the left side of his own face. The argument went nowhere, the way those arguments always go nowhere, and by the 3rd day, he moved on to something more useful. He started practicing. Not blinking is not the practice. He figured that out by the end of day 3. You can't practice not blinking because your eyes don't respond to negative instructions. You can't tell a muscle not to fire. You can only give it something else to do. So he started practicing the way his father had once described standing guard in a conversation Ellery hadn't fully understood at the time. You have to find the place inside it. Not behind your eyes. Inside them. Like your eyes become windows, and there's someone sitting still in the room on the other side. He'd been 16 when his father said that. He thought it was poetic nonsense, the kind of thing veterans say when they can't explain the actual mechanics. He understood it better now. The goal wasn't to suppress the blink reflex. The goal was to stop registering stimuli as events. To look at the cobblestones and the tourists and the gray London sky and find a frequency where it all became continuous, where nothing arrived as new information because everything had already been absorbed as the same information. The cold was the temperature. The wind was the air. The grit was the city. None of it was happening to him. He stood in front of his barracks mirror for 20 minutes every morning and practiced looking at himself without blinking. Not staring. You know the difference if you try it. Staring has effort in it. The white-knuckle thing, the jaw set. What he was looking for was the opposite. The settled eyes. The eyes that had stopped deciding whether they were comfortable. By day 7, he could hold for 41 seconds. By day 10, 58. He didn't tell anyone he was doing this. It would have made a comment. Hargreaves would have issued some kind of directive about not practicing in the mirror during off hours because Hargreaves was the type. He just did it, quietly, in the mornings, before the building fully woke up. There's a thing that happens when you stand guard that no recruiter mentions and no training manual explains properly. The tourists see the coat and the bearskin and they see pageantry. They see history on display. And they're not wrong. That's real. That's genuinely what the thing is partially. The ceremony has weight. But for the man inside the coat, standing on the cobblestones with the Thames wind, finding every gap in the uniform, it's something else too. Something that doesn't have a great word for it in English. The Germans have a few candidates. The Japanese have Mushin, the martial arts concept of the mind without obstruction. Standing guard at its best is something like that. Not emptiness. The wrong word. More like completeness. The state of being fully present in a body that is doing exactly what it was built to do in service of something larger than any individual discomfort. You arrive there or you don't. Most guards find it eventually. Some never quite do. Ellery was going to find it before his next inspection if it killed him. The next inspection fell on a Thursday. Clear morning, cold but not brutal. The kind of November cold that stays honest about what it is rather than disguising itself as mere chill. The sky was the color of a new road. Dark gray, perfectly even, giving nothing away. There were puddles in the courtyard from the rain the night before, and they were already beginning to skin over with the low-grade frost that arrives in London before anyone's quite ready for it. He'd been at his post since 6:50. He stood. The tourists came and went in their usual rhythm. The early ones, 7 to 9, were different from the later ones. The early tourists were the intentional ones. They'd come here, specifically, mapped it on their phones, gotten up earlier than their bodies wanted to. They watched more quietly, took fewer selfies. There was a man with a child, a girl, maybe 7, and the child wasn't being loud or pushy, just watching her small, serious face turn up toward the guardhouse with an expression that Ellery, without looking at her, registered in his peripheral vision as something very close to awe. He didn't let it land as information. Wind at 7:42, coming in from the northeast. Not as strong as the wind 11 days ago, but present. He didn't fight it. He let it move around him. It was the air being the air. He stood. At 9:04, he heard the clipboard before he heard the boots. Pryor came through the line with the same economy she always carried. No ceremony in her inspection. No performance. Just measurement. 7 years of measurement had made her unhurried in a way that felt almost dangerous to the men she inspected. The feeling that she had already seen every permutation of mistake and was simply in the business of categorizing which one she was looking at today. She worked her way down the line. 2 men clear. Hargreaves would note, later, with irritating precision, that she spent 11 seconds on the first guard and 12 on the second. These things got tracked, informally, the way men with too much discipline and not enough to occupy their minds will always find systems to track. She stopped in front of Private Marcus Ellery at 9/11. She looked at the bearskin, the chin strap, his shoulders, his coat. The wind came off the courtyard in a loose gust. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have registered as weather to anyone standing 30 feet away. She looked at his eyes. His eyes were forward. Not staring. She'd been doing this long enough to know the difference. Not the white-knuckle effort of someone suppressing, clinching, white-knuckling their way through a moment. Something else. The settled thing. The eyes that had stopped being in a fight with what was in front of them. She held her place. 12 seconds. She looked at his left eye, still dry, the red completely gone, looking forward with the particular quality of something that had found its arrangement. 13 seconds. He didn't move. 14. She moved on. There was no mark on the clipboard this time. She wrote down 3 things in her private shorthand over the course of the full inspection, and none of them were about Ellery. She went through the notes in the narrow office at 11:30. Sun doing its brief mid-afternoon thing through the courtyard window, her sandwich untouched at the edge of the desk for the moment. No mark for Ellery. She closed the inspection log. Here's what no one tells you, because no one thinks to tell it. Color Sergeant Pryor had received a disciplinary note herself, once. 17 years ago. She'd been a private, recently posted, and she'd broken position. Not a blink, something worse, a full quarter turn of her head in response to a shout from a crowd. Some idiot tourist who'd done it deliberately, the kind that think it's a game. She turned, caught herself immediately. Turned back, caught immediately by the inspecting sergeant. The note was in her record. She'd looked at it every year or so. Not out of shame. She'd stopped feeling shame about it somewhere around year 3. She looked at it to remember what it felt like. The way the moment had moved through her before she could intercept it, the way her body had decided, and then her mind had caught up too late. She looked at it to remember that the guards she marked were not careless. Not mostly. They were people in the middle of learning something genuinely difficult, something that asked for more than discipline, something that asked for an interior architecture that you had to build yourself, in your own time, with no blueprint. The note was the system doing its job. The system was supposed to do its job. That didn't make any of it pleasant. Ellery didn't know whether he'd passed until Hargreaves didn't tap him on the shoulder at 1400 hours. He waited. 1400 came and went. 1415. 1430. He was cleaning kit in the equipment room when Yates appeared in the doorway and said, with the profound nonchalance of someone trying not to look like they've been keeping track, "No tap." Ellery looked up. "No tap," he confirmed. Yates held up a hand in what was technically a wave. "Good," he said, and left. That was the whole of it. No ceremony. No acknowledgement beyond the absence of a consequence. The note that didn't arrive in the envelope, the list his name hadn't appeared on, the mark that didn't get made. Clean inspection. He went back to cleaning his kit. His hands, he noticed, were very steady. He wrote to his father that evening. Not a long letter. He'd never been a long letter person, and his father wasn't either. They communicated in the efficient shorthand of people who understand each other well enough that half the sentence can stay unwritten. He told him about the inspection. Not the first one, the one with the note. The second one, the clean one. He wrote, "I found the place you met. The inside of the eyes thing. I found it." He mailed it the next morning. 3 days later, a letter came back. His father's handwriting was larger than his. Not messy, just unapologetic about the space it occupied. He'd written 2 sentences on an otherwise blank piece of paper. "Good. Now forget you found it. It only works if you stop remembering it's there." November became December. The cold got serious about itself. The tourists changed texture. Fewer families, more couples, people in better coats. The Thames mist started arriving in the mornings before the light did, and the guardhouse at Horse Guards Parade had its own particular relationship with that mist, the way old stone buildings absorb moisture and hold it. Ellery stood 4 more inspections between November and January. Pryor conducted 2 of them, both clean. He was aware of her presence the way you become aware of a particular wind direction. Not anxiously, not with dread, just as information about the environment he was operating in. She was the measurement. He was the thing being measured. Neither of those facts required any particular emotional response. He found that, eventually, he'd stopped practicing in front of the mirror. Not because he'd given up, because the thing he'd been practicing had moved somewhere past the territory that required practice. It had settled. There's a photograph that someone took in January. He doesn't know who took it or where it came from. He only knows it exists because a fellow guardsman showed it to him on a phone one afternoon, a picture that had apparently done some small amount of circulating in the particular corners of the internet that collect photographs of household division guards. It was taken from the tourist side of the railing of Horse Guards Parade, in what looked like morning light, the Thames mist still present in the background. The guard in the photograph was in full post position. Coat, bearskin, rifle at exact angle. The face was forward. The eyes were forward. It took Ellery a moment to recognize himself. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He was looking at someone who had found the thing. The interior arrangement. The body doing what it was built to do without anything in the face announcing the effort. He looked, from the outside, like a piece of the building, like something that had been standing in that exact spot for longer than he'd been alive and would continue standing there after he was gone. He gave the phone back and didn't say anything, but he thought about his father's letter. Forget you found it. He understood, looking at the photograph, why his father had said that. Because the face in the photograph didn't look like a man who had found something. It looked like a man who had simply arrived at a place where the finding was no longer the point. The note was still in the envelope in his locker. He hadn't thrown it away. He thought, sometimes, that he probably wouldn't. That in 40 years, if things went a certain way, he'd become the kind of person who kept the evidence of a learning, not the achievement, the learning in a drawer somewhere, and took it out occasionally to remember what it felt like to be in the middle of becoming something. The wind had made a decision for him that morning in November. His body had made a decision the wind authorized. And then he'd spent 13 days negotiating a different arrangement, and then a clean inspection, and then another, and another, and none of it because the wind stopped. The wind was always going to come. That was the deal. The Thames was going to keep sending it. The city was going to keep making its grit. The November mornings were always going to be exactly as cold as they intended to be with no regard for what was standing in them. The wind didn't change. He did. The tourists outside the railing on a typical morning don't know any of this. They see the coat, the bearskin, the stillness. They take the photograph. They walk away. They tell people later, I saw one of those guards who doesn't move. He didn't even blink. And they're right. He doesn't. Not anymore. But there was a day, an ordinary Tuesday in November, 9:17 in the morning, the wind off the Thames arriving without announcing itself, when he did. And a mark went on a clipboard. And a note went in an envelope. And a man stood for 43 more minutes with grit in his eye and moisture tracking down his cheek, and his face locked exactly where it was supposed to be, because that was the job, and the job didn't wait for you to finish feeling things before it required you to look like you weren't. That's the part the photograph doesn't show. That's the part that made the photograph possible.